The rain had started before midnight, and by 2 in the morning it was striking the emergency entrance in silver sheets, hard enough to rattle the glass and make the automatic doors hesitate each time they opened. Inside Trauma Bay 3, the fluorescent lights flattened every face into the same exhausted sharpness. Residents moved quickly because speed looked like confidence, and the monitors kept up their thin electronic chorus, calm only until the instant calm became fiction. Naomi Vance stood at the edge of the bay in navy scrubs with one hand on a pressure bag and the other already reaching for a tray no one had requested. Around St. Catherine's Medical Center in Norfolk, most people described her in nearly identical terms. She was quiet, competent, and easy to overlook if a person mistook volume for importance. Dr. Caleb Thorne made that mistake often. He glanced at her only long enough to dismiss her, then turned back to the soaked patient being wheeled in from the ambulance. He made a cutting remark about improvisation and announced, with the easy arrogance that had made him both admired and imitated, that equipment would be requested if and when he needed it. A few residents laughed because they had learned that laughter near Caleb Thorne functioned like currency. Naomi did not answer. She looked at the patient's chest, then at the men who had brought him in, then at the water pooled in the rails of the gurney and the faint smell of fuel and salt lifting off the man's jacket. She said quietly that he needed pressure relief on the left side. Thorne brushed the concern aside with theatrical impatience and declared that the patient needed imaging, labs, and a team that did not jump to conclusions. The patient's skin had gone the wrong kind of pale, not bloodless but tight, as though the body had already begun pulling inward to protect what little balance remained. His breathing was shallow and incomplete. One side of his chest lagged behind the other. The pulse oximeter lost a point, then another. Naomi moved the tray closer. Thorne finally looked at her, and his smile had all the warmth of a blade. He mocked her instinct to play hero on night shift and told her to let the adults assess the trauma. Near the doorway, the men who had escorted the patient became very still. Naomi leaned in just enough to study the man's breathing again and said that he would not survive the trip to CT in that condition. Thorne snapped at her to stop. Then the monitor dropped, and the entire room changed shape in a single second. Panic never announced itself first. It rearranged the air, and Naomi was already moving when everyone else was still translating the alarm into action. Long before anyone in that hospital would remember her name for the right reasons, Naomi Vance had been working nights for 11 months at St. Catherine's, 15 minutes from the waterfront, 20 from Little Creek, and infinitely far from the version of herself no one there suspected. She rented a narrow apartment over a dry cleaner on Granby Street. She drove an old gray sedan that was always clean inside and always backed into its parking space. She drank black coffee, carried protein bars she rarely ate, and arrived 7 minutes early for every shift without exception. She never lingered in break room gossip, never pushed herself into the center of conversations, and never offered stories about her life. In a hospital, that kind of privacy was enough to guarantee that everyone else would build a story for her. The residents decided she was shy. Some of the newer nurses concluded she was probably difficult. The older nurses, who had seen enough years to recognize restraint when it stood in front of them, kept their thoughts mostly to themselves. Naomi had a way of taking report that unsettled careless people. She listened not only to what was said, but to what had been omitted. She watched hands, eyes, posture, hesitation. She checked tubing without asking permission. She remembered details no one else believed mattered until, suddenly, they mattered more than anything in the room. 3 weeks into her job, she had quietly prevented a dangerous medication mix-up by asking a pharmacist one neutral question. Dr. Thorne later thanked the pharmacist in front of the team and never mentioned Naomi's role. A month later, during a pediatric scare that turned out to be a frightened parent and a faulty home reading, Naomi had stabilized the room before anyone else even realized it needed stabilizing. Later that same night, Thorne remarked within earshot of half the station that she was useful as long as she stayed in her lane. He said things like that often. Caleb Thorne was the hospital's star trauma attending, young enough to still care what he looked like in photos, experienced enough to understand exactly how power worked. Administrators adored him because donors adored him. Residents copied his sharp tone because they mistook edge for excellence. He claimed to value order, but what he truly valued was orbit. He liked being the fixed point around which everyone else moved. Naomi never seemed to orbit properly, and that irritated him in ways he could not quite disguise. She never challenged him theatrically, which meant he never got the satisfaction of dismissing her openly heroic rebellion. Instead, she made observations in careful, neutral language. She would mention concern about a pressure trend instead of accusing him of missing something obvious. She would ask whether respiratory should be brought in now or after transport, rather than saying he was already late. She offered people a chance to correct themselves with dignity. Some did. Thorne usually did not. The humiliations came in small institutional doses, exactly the kind that sounded petty when listed individually and corrosive when lived repeatedly. He called her the whisper nurse during rounds, and the nickname clung to a few residents for days. He told her to fetch linen while she was charting a complex handoff, and then praised a resident for efficiency after Naomi had done the actual work. He overruled her suggestion to delay a transfer by 10 minutes for a patient who later coded in the elevator and had to be brought back upstairs. Once, not realizing Naomi could hear him from the med room, he told a travel nurse that she was technically excellent, but that he worried about people who never seemed surprised, because they were either hiding something or compensating for something. Naomi labeled syringes, finished her work, and kept moving. There were always cracks, though, in the version of her people preferred. A retired Marine once came in with chest pain, frightened and trying not to show it. Naomi adjusted his blanket, checked his leads, and assured him with a calm that came from somewhere deeper than bedside manner. Without thinking, he answered with a reflexive acknowledgement of rank. He looked startled the moment he heard himself say it, and so did she. During a mass casualty drill, while executives hovered in hallways with clipboards and self-importance, Naomi studied the evacuation map once and noted a choke point that would fail if both stairwells were compromised. The emergency planning coordinator frowned, then later altered the route exactly as she had suggested. When a helicopter passed low over the hospital roof, most nurses looked up. Naomi looked to the exits. She kept an old coin in her locker, worn dull from handling. She tied tourniquets one-handed without breaking eye contact with frightened patients. She could open sterile packaging in near darkness. She once heard an ambulance radio patch from across the station and murmured that the crew was leaving something out. They were. Then there was the scar along the inside of her left wrist, pale and narrow beneath the watchband, too precise to have come from an ordinary accident. Nurse manager Linda Greer noticed it once, and with casualness too deliberate to be genuine, asked whether Naomi came from a military family. Naomi replied only that it was something like that, and that answer fueled 3 months of rumor. Norfolk was a city that recognized military posture even when uniforms were absent. The city understood the clipped stillness of enlisted men in line at a grocery store, the formal courtesy of officers in civilian clothes, the quiet endurance of spouses who had learned how to wait. Naomi came to work in plain scrubs, plain shoes, hair pinned the same way every shift, her face carrying nothing but fatigue and focus. So the hospital invented smaller explanations. Perhaps she was divorced, perhaps anxious. Perhaps carrying one of those tragic private histories people like to assign to anyone competent and silent. What almost no one guessed was both simpler and harder than all of that. Naomi had learned long ago that if she said very little, other people would tell her everything she needed to know about themselves. Caleb Thorne told her who he was almost every shift. One Thursday, he dismissed her concern about a post-operative patient's breathing because the numbers looked fine. 40 minutes later, the patient deteriorated and needed escalation. Thorne returned annoyed not by the change in condition, but by the inconvenience of having been interrupted. Naomi handed him the chart and pointed out where the trend had begun. He saw her notation, realized she had documented the warning, and told her that next time she needed to be more assertive. It was one of his favorite institutional tricks: ignore the warning, then criticize the tone in which it had been offered. Naomi answered only that she had noted it. He hated that word. The emergency department had its own hierarchy even among people with the same credentials. Loud nurses were called emotional. Efficient nurses were praised until they became inconvenient. Quiet nurses were treated like furniture, until a crisis exposed how much of the room they had actually been holding together. Naomi understood all of that by the end of her second week. She also understood Linda Greer, who kept peace by protecting status. Linda was not cruel in the dramatic sense. She was worse in the bureaucratic sense. She could watch something unfair happen, calculate the social cost of naming it, and choose silence while still sounding sympathetic. On the night everything changed, at 1:47 in the morning, Naomi was restocking airway supplies after helping an older man through a panic attack he felt embarrassed by. The waiting room television flickered soundlessly. Rain crawled down the glass. Somewhere deeper in the department, a printer jammed and someone muttered a curse. Then the EMS patch came in. Male, 40s, waterfront trauma, respiratory compromise, possible blunt chest injury, altered mental status, private security escort, arrival in 4 minutes. The phrase private security escort made several people look up. Thorne, who had been drinking espresso and talking about a conference panel he had been invited to join, straightened immediately. Naomi was already moving toward Trauma Bay 3. When a resident noted that Bay 2 was open, Naomi answered that Bay 3 was better for access from the side entrance in weather like this. Thorne heard her, smirked, and mocked the suggestion. They used Bay 3 anyway. When the side doors burst open and the gurney came in with 2 soaked men flanking it, everyone understood why. The patient's paperwork identified him as Daniel Cross, but his hands said something else entirely. His knuckles were marked by old damage that had healed thickly. His shoulders carried the imbalance of long years under load. A faded tan line on one wrist suggested a watch worn by habit, not style. When Naomi cut away the soaked sleeve, she saw the edge of a black trident tattooed high enough to stay hidden under most clothing. She did not react, but something old and unwelcome moved through her with the force of recognition. A resident called out the dropping blood pressure. Thorne asked for the portable imaging equipment. Naomi had already positioned the chest tray within reach. He noticed it and sighed loud enough for the room. She repeated that the left side was rising poorly and that pressure was building. He argued that breath sounds were distorted by fluid and that they would image first. One of the escorts took a step forward and reported that the patient had worsened in transport. Thorne cut him off. Naomi looked at that escort only once, but it was enough to register details. The haircut was civilian short, but not civilian in spirit. His stance was balanced even in wet shoes. He scanned exits before faces. He noticed her noticing him, and for one moment seemed almost to know her before the expression vanished. The pulse oximeter fell again. Naomi adjusted oxygen, checked shoulder movement, read the chest, the color, the rhythm, the mechanism. She told Thorne again that pressure was building. He ignored her and ordered transport. The gurney rolled exactly a few feet before the patient arched once and the monitor screamed. Chaos arrived the way it always did in real rooms, with too many voices at once, with wheels locking, with someone swearing, with another voice calling for respiratory, with the absurd continuity of rain on the roof while a life began collapsing indoors. Naomi stepped to the left side of the bed and told them to stop. Thorne ordered her out of the way. She told him that the left side had to be relieved immediately. He repeated himself. Priya Desai, a younger resident who still possessed enough humility to recognize uncertainty as dangerous, looked from Naomi to the chest to the monitor and asked what if Naomi was right. Thorne snapped that Naomi was not making the call. Naomi had already opened the kit. There are moments when a person's entire life seems to stand behind one decision, not because the choice looks dramatic from the outside, but because the person makes it with a calm too precise to be guesswork. Naomi's hands did not shake. She addressed Priya directly and asked for verbal confirmation. Priya saw the numbers, the breathing, the color draining from the patient's mouth, and authorized the intervention. Thorne objected, but he was already late. Naomi relieved the pressure with the kind of swift, practiced control that drew attention only because it lacked performance. There was a release, a shift, the brief, violent correction of the body's mechanical betrayal. The monitor climbed. The patient drew a fuller breath. The bay inhaled with him. For 2 full seconds, no one said anything. Then Priya whispered the kind of stunned reverence people only use when they have just seen competence reveal itself. One escort closed his eyes once, briefly, in private gratitude. Thorne stepped back as if the floor had moved beneath him. Naomi secured the dressing, reassessed the chest, and moved the room forward without claiming. She noted the need for imaging, warm fluids, and blood readiness given cold water exposure and blunt force. Thorne recovered quickly enough to accuse her of exceeding scope. Naomi answered only that the patient had been crashing. Priya asked how she had known so fast. Naomi replied that the patient had been telling them. The next 20 minutes turned the trauma bay into a controlled storm. The patient stabilized enough for scanning. Naomi had already arranged warm blankets and core temperature monitoring. She asked the escorts short, exact questions that produced more useful answers than Thorne's broader commands had. Salt water exposure had been under 10 minutes. There had been no loss of pulse in transit, no known medications. The escorts answered her, not him, and everyone in the room noticed. On the way to imaging, the patient's eyelids fluttered. He did not fully focus, but he turned fractionally toward Naomi's voice when she told him to stay with her. Something in his face changed at the sound, not recognition exactly, but the body's memory of safety preceding the mind. Imaging later confirmed what Naomi had seen before anyone else admitted it. Word moved through the department immediately, in the fast and ugly way all hospital stories moved. The quiet nurse had challenged Thorne. The quiet nurse had been right. The quiet nurse had made the residents look young without ever raising her voice. When the patient returned from imaging, the temporary alias had vanished. Security tightened. An escort spoke privately with administration, and afterward Linda Greer emerged pale and very awake. The patient was not Daniel Cross after all. He was Commander Owen Cade, head of an operational SEAL unit out of Virginia Beach, injured during a maritime training transfer made dangerous by storm conditions and bad luck. Suddenly, every choice in Trauma Bay 3 mattered more. Suddenly, Caleb Thorne had a problem. Naomi heard the name and gave away almost nothing, but behind her eyes something tightened. She knew the name. She continued charting. Success should have made the room quieter. Instead, it made Thorne meaner. By 4 in the morning, Cade was in the ICU, intubated, stabilized, and slowly settling into numbers that no longer terrified everyone watching them. Outside, the storm moved offshore. Inside, the hospital had that strange, pre-dawn stillness that always felt borrowed rather than earned. Naomi documented the case with exactness. At 4:18, she recorded her initial concern over asymmetrical chest rise. At 4:19, she documented escalation to the attending. At 4:20, she recorded worsening status. At 4:21, she noted verbal confirmation from Dr. Desai for emergency intervention. At 4:22, she documented improvement. She wrote with the calm of someone who knew that clean writing survived ugly meetings. 10 minutes later, Thorne appeared at the station with Linda Greer beside him and ordered Naomi into a conference room. Linda said little. The room smelled of old coffee and dry erase markers. One wall was glass with blinds half closed, which made the whole space feel more accusatory. Linda folded her hands on the table. Thorne remained standing, a posture that suggested he wanted the advantage of height even now. He informed Naomi that she was being placed on temporary administrative hold pending review for performing beyond nursing scope during a sensitive trauma admission without attending authorization. Naomi asked whether the punishment was for saving a patient. Thorne replied that a panicked resident had made a bad call and that Naomi should have deferred to him. She reminded him that Priya had authorized the intervention. He argued that the real issue was her habit of confusing intuition with authority. Linda slid forward a form describing administrative hold, badge surrender, and a preliminary note citing disruptive conduct and failure to respect chain of command. It was not even an elegant lie. Naomi studied the document and then calmly told them to preserve the original chart and the room footage. For the first time, Thorne's expression changed. Linda answered too quickly that all records were, of course, retained. Naomi stood and said good. When Thorne demanded something more, perhaps gratitude or distress, she set her badge on the table and told him to stop speaking as though she were the reason the commander had nearly died. She left without waiting for permission. In the hallway, a clerk saw her without a badge and looked away too fast. That was how injustice spread through institutions, not only through deliberate villains but through spectators. By dawn, versions of the story had already started hardening. Some heard Naomi had gone rogue. Some heard she had done something military to a special operations patient. Thorne remarked in the physician workroom, loudly enough to be repeated, that this was what happened when support staff confused adrenaline with expertise. Priya found Naomi in the locker room packing her spare scrub top and declared the whole thing insane. Naomi said only that she knew. Priya protested that she had given the order. Naomi replied that they would say she was inexperienced. Priya insisted she had been there. Naomi answered that so had he. When Priya demanded to know why Naomi was not fighting harder, Naomi replied that she was and then asked whether Priya had preserved her notes. She had. Naomi said good and walked out. Outside, the cold morning air finally hit her face. Memory arrived not as fear but as atmosphere. Salt in the air, wet concrete, the distant idea of rotors, an old voice in an earpiece telling Wren to move now. She drove not home but to a 24-hour diner near the naval base, ordered coffee she did not want, sat with her back to the wall and wrote the timeline into a small waterproof notebook despite already knowing it by heart. Times, exact words, sequence of refusal, witness positions. At 6:12 her phone buzzed with an unknown number. A security chief from St. Catherine's asked whether she was available to return for questions on behalf of hospital administration and a military liaison. Naomi said yes. When she walked back into the hospital at 6:41, security was tighter, the ICU corridor partly closed, and the building's mood had shifted from gossip to caution. Linda Greer met her near the elevators with a smile stretched so tight it looked painful. She thanked Naomi for coming and, trying to feel her way through the change in the air, hinted that there were people asking very specific questions. Naomi told her that this was good. Linda, suddenly unsure of everything she had been so practical about, asked whether there was something in Naomi's background the hospital should have known. Naomi answered that there had been and that no one had asked. Before Linda could recover, a new voice entered the corridor. Captain Elise Navarro of Naval Special Warfare introduced herself in civilian clothes so plainly worn that no one mistook her for ordinary. Beside her were a compliance officer and a broad-shouldered man whose stillness gave away a senior enlisted life no matter how quietly he tried to hold it. Navarro asked Naomi to join them. Naomi shook her hand. Navarro's eyes dropped, almost imperceptibly, to Naomi's grip, her stance, the old scar at the wrist. Recognition flickered there, incomplete but alive. The next conference room was smaller and windowless. Thorne sat at one end of the table. Linda sat halfway down. Priya had been included now that someone with authority had realized her account mattered. Navarro took the chair opposite Thorne. The compliance officer opened a laptop. The broad-shouldered man stayed by the door. Naomi sat nearest the wall. No one offered coffee, and the seriousness of that omission pleased her more than it should have. Navarro began with a politeness so controlled it felt dangerous. She stated that they were conducting a time-sensitive factual review of Commander Owen Cade's trauma admission. Thorne immediately tried to retake the room, insisting that the institution had followed protocol. Navarro stopped him with one lifted hand and said she would ask the questions. The compliance officer recited the timeline. Initial concern for a left-sided pressure event raised at 4:18 by Ms. Vance, attending override, worsening condition, intervention, improvement. Thorne attempted to generalize, claiming that clinical judgment evolved under pressure. Priya spoke before fear could stop her and confirmed that Naomi had raised the issue twice before she herself spoke. Navarro asked Naomi on what basis she had acted. Naomi answered with pure clinical economy: asymmetrical rise, declining oxygenation, mechanism of injury, worsening distress. Navarro asked why the chest tray had been ready before confirmation. Naomi replied that delay killed. Thorne argued that even if she had eventually been right, the real issue was that she had inserted herself into a physician decision chain. The man at the door turned his head and looked at him then, and somehow that quiet look carried more warning than a shouted threat could have. Navarro asked Naomi who had taught her to document as she did. Naomi answered that it had been a long time ago. Navarro asked where. Naomi said only that it had been in another life. Then Navarro slid a printed page across the table. It was an old credentials summary pulled from somewhere deeper than her hospital file, incomplete, sanitized, unmistakably military in origin. Naomi asked where it had come from. Navarro explained that after one of Cade's escorts reported that Naomi's voice sounded familiar during triage, military records had been cross-referenced. Priya turned sharply toward Naomi. Linda went motionless. Thorne gave a dismissive scoff and insisted that whatever prior experience Naomi had was irrelevant to civilian nursing scope. Navarro said that sometimes prior experience changed context. Then she asked directly whether Naomi had served. After a long second, Naomi answered yes. In what capacity? Medical, be more specific. Naomi said nothing. The man by the door spoke for the first time. He said with visible restraint that he thought he knew her. His name was Master Chief Dean Keller. Naomi exhaled the smallest breath. He had more gray in his beard than before, but his eyes were unchanged. He studied her as if fitting a long familiar silhouette into newer years, and said he did not believe he was wrong. Thorne still wanted the conversation returned to procedure. Navarro turned on him fully and explained, without raising her voice, that before sunrise his patient had been one of the most operationally significant field commanders in the region, that the nurse he had suspended had identified a life-threatening deterioration he had missed, had intervened under verbal authorization, and had stabilized him. Context, Navarro said, was therefore very much part of the procedure. Then the compliance officer pivoted the laptop and displayed the chart audit trail. Entries had been modified at 5:03 from the attending terminal. Thorne called them clarifying edits. The compliance officer pointed out that the changes removed Naomi's earlier escalation note. Thorne described this as streamlining the narrative. Priya let out a disbelieving sound. Navarro told him not to characterize alteration of a trauma record as streamlining. Linda attempted to supply a reasonable explanation and failed. The room continued tightening around truth. They moved after that to the ICU corridor. Morning light lay across the polished floor. Machines hummed softly beyond glass. Two security staff stood farther down, trying and failing to look unimportant. Naomi waited near the window, arms loosely folded, no badge, no title visible, no rank except composure. Keller approached and in a low voice asked whether she intended to make him say it first. Naomi greeted him properly by rank. Relief and disbelief passed across his face. He said he knew it. He reminded her that after Raqqa Inlet, everyone had thought she was finished with that life. She answered that she had resigned. He said they had assumed she was done with all of it. She said she was. He glanced toward the ICU room holding Commander Owen Cade and remarked on the odds. Naomi corrected him. Odds had nothing to do with it. A man had been hurt and she had done her job. Keller said that still sounded like her. Then an ICU nurse emerged and announced that the commander was responsive briefly. Everyone turned. Cade looked smaller in the bed than men like him ever looked standing up, but the shape of command still remained in the stillness. His eyes opened only partway at first. A physician checked his pupils. A nurse adjusted a line. Navarro told him he was safe and in Virginia and that they would keep questions short. His gaze traveled slowly through the room until it stopped on Naomi in the doorway. He stared at her for one long, disoriented second, and then memory returned with the force of muscle. He whispered a single name, Wren. The word landed in that room at different speeds for different people. Priya looked confused. Linda looked lost. Keller closed his eyes briefly in recognition. Navarro did not move at all. Naomi stepped one pace closer and told him to stay calm, to remain down, to conserve his strength. Cade said the name again, stronger this time, and the room changed around the sound of it. Navarro asked whether he knew Nurse Vance. Cade, still hazy from sedation, answered that if he was alive, there was a fair chance she had something to do with it. Then he asked why she was not wearing a badge. No one answered immediately because the question did not merely request information. It exposed everyone present. Navarro explained that administrative action had been taken after the intervention and that the matter was under review. Cade asked Naomi whether she had decompressed him before CT. She said yes. He gave a faint nod and compared it to Basra Channel. For Naomi, the phrase arrived like old weather, dark water, engine fire, a teammate bleeding, Cade half-conscious, static on the radio, her own hands moving faster than fear. Navarro urged him to rest, but he looked at Naomi and told her to tell them. She refused. Keller did it for her. He told the room that Naomi Vance had served as a hospital corpsman, first class attached in specialized medical support to Naval Special Warfare Operations, Col Saint Ren. Priya raised a hand to her mouth. Linda's eyes widened. Thorne's face emptied. Keller continued, saying she had been the medic people asked for when things had already gone bad, not because she ever talked big, but because she brought people home. Naomi tried softly to stop him, but he was already looking at Thorne and asking whether he had truly suspended her. From that point forward, the official version emerged with careful edges. Nothing classified was described in any satisfying detail, but enough became clear to destroy the stories the hospital had preferred. Naomi had enlisted young, trained in military medicine, moved through narrow pipelines most civilians never heard of, and spent years supporting operations in places the news summarized with maps and acronyms. Much of what she had done would never become public, but the pattern was unmistakable. She had treated casualties under fire, in flood water, in rotor wash, in blackout conditions, in moments when bodies failed faster than doctrine. She had once kept Owen Cade alive during a maritime operation gone wrong overseas. Basra Channel was not a metaphor. It was history. Naomi had left that world not in disgrace, not even quite in burnout, but in exhausted clarity. She had spent too long watching hierarchy mistaken for wisdom and quieter people forgotten after saving louder ones. So she had earned her civilian nursing credentials and chosen a hospital near the coast where she hoped ordinary work might finally be ordinary. Instead, she found Caleb Thorne. When Priya asked why she had never told anyone, Naomi answered with the sentence that later outlived every meeting and memo in the building. Sick people, she said, did not need her resume. They needed her to notice. By noon, St. Catherine's was deep in controlled panic. Executives who never cared about night shift culture suddenly wanted briefings. Risk management wanted preserved records. Legal wanted exact language. ICU wanted fewer interruptions. Caleb Thorne wanted the whole day reversed. Naomi was given temporary visitor access while the review escalated far beyond Linda Greer's normal ability to manage appearances. Her badge had not yet been returned, but the tone around her had changed so completely that it might as well have been a different institution. Residents stopped meeting Thorne's eye and started overcompensating in Naomi's direction. A transport aide held an elevator for her and called her ma'am without understanding why. Priya found her by a window overlooking the loading dock and confessed that she felt foolish. She listed the signs she had missed, the way Naomi moved, documented, anticipated, and made security-trained men listen without trying. Naomi answered that she was, in fact, intense, which made Priya laugh despite herself. When Priya asked whether she missed the old life, Naomi said only that she missed the people who did not need volume to prove competence. That answer traveled farther than either of them intended. Meanwhile, Captain Navarro requested a formal review panel before the end of shift, documented and witnessed, with chain of custody on records, statements from bedside staff, and preservation of all bay footage. Any hope Thorne had of burying this as an internal misunderstanding died as soon as the request was entered. He tried twice more to retake the narrative. First, he told an administrator that Naomi's military background was irrelevant to nursing scope. The administrator, finally unable to pretend not to understand the real issue, asked why his chart edits had omitted her warning. Then he tried charm on Navarro, saying that everyone wanted a fair process. Navarro replied that he should have started with one. By early afternoon, 3 additional nurses had quietly submitted statements describing other occasions when Thorne had dismissed escalations, and later blamed staff for not being assertive enough. None of those cases had ended in disaster. All of them formed a pattern. Linda Greer, seeing the structure of that pattern for the first time because outside pressure had stripped her usual excuses away, approached Naomi and admitted that she should have pushed back earlier. Naomi asked whether she meant earlier than last night, earlier than last month, or earlier than Naomi's first week. Linda accepted the rebuke. She said she had thought she was protecting staff by staying practical. Naomi corrected her with calm precision. Linda had been protecting comfort, not staff. The review panel began at 2 in the afternoon in a room large enough to make accountability look official. Bottled water sat at every place in the hopeful tradition of meetings that knew they were about to become unpleasant. Present were Captain Navarro, the Chief Medical Officer, compliance personnel, legal counsel, ICU leadership, Priya, Linda, 2 night nurses, Caleb Thorne, Naomi, and later, by secure video from the ICU, Commander Cade. The Chief Medical Officer opened formally and stated that they were reviewing both the clinical events of Cade's admission and the administrative action taken against Naomi Vance. The footage played first. Without sound, the fluorescent reality looked even harsher. Naomi placing the tray, Naomi indicating the left side, Thorne dismissing, the monitor drop, Priya's authorization, Naomi intervening, the patient stabilizing. Then the chart audit appeared beside the timestamps. No charisma survived slow-motion evidence. And playback ended. The silence in the room became so complete that the ventilation system itself sounded accusatory. The Chief Medical Officer asked Thorne whether he disputed the clinical necessity of the intervention. He tried to redirect the discussion to process and authority. Navarro cut through that redirection by restating the actual process. Active decompensation, physician verbal confirmation, attending delay, documented warning. Priya's statement followed. Her voice shook at first and then held. She explained that she had trusted Naomi's assessment because Naomi had sounded like the only person in the room who had seen this before. The 2 night nurses corroborated the timeline. One of them, visibly nervous, added that Thorne had a pattern of criticizing staff who escalated concerns in front of residents. Then compliance projected the metadata of the chart edits. Every deletion was traceable. Every timestamp was visible. Thorne said he had been clarifying the sequence under stress. The compliance officer asked why that clarification had erased the original nursing warning. Thorne had no answer stronger than the one he had already failed with. Then Commander Owen Cade appeared on secure video from the ICU, pale with fatigue and authority sharpened by pain rather than diminished by it. The Chief Medical Officer asked only for factual clarification. Cade confirmed that he had identified Naomi based on prior service and that she had once been his medic on a previous operation. Asked whether he believed her intervention had been beneficial, he answered that he was alive because she had made it. No one moved. Then he added, in a tone almost conversational, that anyone treating critical patients ought to be able to hear competent warning without needing it delivered louder. He confirmed that Naomi had not identified herself to him before he recognized her and had not sought recognition afterward. That detail mattered enormously. It collapsed the ugliest theory still hiding in the room, that she might have been staging a display of secret prestige. She had not. She had acted first and been recognized second. Cade ended by saying that if the hospital punished Naomi, It would not be correcting a protocol problem. It would be advertising a culture problem. When the call ended, the chief medical officer asked Thorne whether he had anything else to add. He said he had made the best judgment possible with the information available. Naomi spoke then for the first time in that session without being prompted. She said he had possessed the information and had rejected the source. Thorne, stripped now of the confidence that had carried him through years of lesser rooms, tried one final accusation. He asked whether everyone was expected to believe that none of this had anything to do with her background, that she had not been waiting for an opportunity to prove herself. Naomi looked at him steadily and asked to whom she would need to prove anything. He had no answer. She leaned forward just enough to make the truth impossible to evade and said that she had not needed Commander Cade to know who she was. He had done that on his own. What she had needed was for Thorne to listen before that happened. The chief medical officer wrote something down. Linda Greer, perhaps feeling the last available moral exit opening under pressure, admitted into the record that she had supported the administrative hold before reviewing the footage and that doing so had been a failure of judgment. Naomi did not soften the moment for her. The outcomes were delivered without drama, which made them feel all the more final. Naomi Vance's administrative hold was rescinded immediately. Her charting was affirmed as clinically appropriate and materially significant. All preliminary disciplinary language would be removed from her file. A formal review of emergency escalation culture in the trauma department would begin, including investigation of retaliation concerns. Caleb Thorne was placed on immediate non-clinical status pending peer review of conduct, documentation integrity, and supervisory practice. Linda Greer was removed from direct disciplinary authority until administrative review concluded. Mandatory training in stop-the-line escalation and cross-disciplinary action during emergent care would be implemented across the department. No one applauded. Real consequence rarely sounded cinematic. It sounded procedural on the way down. Thorne sat perfectly still, the years of status draining out of him in real time. Then he looked at Naomi and said that she could have told them who she was. Naomi answered with the sentence that burned itself into departmental memory. She said she had told them every shift. Justice did not arrive as a single clean scene. It came as sequence. First the finding, then the discomfort, then the scramble of people revising their memories to make themselves look better inside the new truth. By evening, the hospital was well into that third stage. Residents who had once laughed at Thorne's jokes said they had noticed he seemed off lately. An attending from another unit claimed she had always suspected Naomi had an unusual background. A nurse who had barely spoken to her in months suddenly asked whether she wanted coffee. Naomi accepted none of it as apology. Still, the building had changed in ways even cynics could feel. Doorways opened faster when she approached. Questions directed at her were real questions now, not tests disguised as instructions. Embarrassment shadowed faces that had once worn easy dismissal. It was not yet respect in every case, but it was at least honesty. Late that evening, Priya caught up with Naomi outside the ICU again. The hall had gone quiet in the strange way hospitals quiet down after too much truth in one day. Priya asked what happened now. Naomi looked through the glass at the sleeping commander and said that now people would pretend they had learned faster than they actually had. Priya admitted she meant what happened for Naomi. Naomi said she would come back to work if they let her. Priya seemed startled by the simplicity of that answer. After everything, after the reveal, the panel, the consequences, she still intended to return to night shift and ordinary fluorescent labor. Naomi explained that ordinary work was the point. People became dangerous when they thought some lives counted as significant enough to deserve vigilance while others did not. The old woman with sepsis in room 9 mattered. The drunk with the head laceration mattered. The frightened father in the waiting room mattered. A commander mattered too, but not more. Priya listened the way younger people do. When the lesson arrives in a shape, they know they will spend years growing into. Before Naomi left, Captain Navarro approached with a small envelope and said the hospital had reinstated access pending badge reissue. Inside was a temporary pass. Navarro also informed her that Commander Cade had asked, when fully coherent, whether Naomi would consider visiting before discharge. Naomi studied the envelope, then said she might. Keller, lingering a little farther back, told her that some people from the old world would probably reach out once word traveled. Naomi said that she had expected that. He asked whether she wanted back in. She answered with a quiet certainty that she did not. That life had taken enough. He nodded as if he had known the answer before asking. She finally stepped outside into a city washed clean by the storm. The air still carried salt. Her old gray sedan waited where she had left it, backed in, clean inside, ordinary. She stood beside it for a moment and let the day settle. Inside the hospital behind her, hallways were already rewriting themselves. Policies would be drafted, trainings scheduled, quiet apologies offered. Some people would improve. Some would simply become more careful about how they looked while remaining the same. Institutions changed slowly, but sometimes they changed because one person refused to let a lie settle into the official record. Naomi had not won because she revealed a hidden past. She had won because the truth had been true before anyone knew her history. That was the part she cared about. The next night she returned 7 minutes early. Her temporary badge clipped to her scrub top, coffee black in hand. The rain was gone, but the glass doors still shivered faintly when they opened. A few people greeted her differently. Some with respect, some with awkwardness, some with the brittle enthusiasm of people trying to repair themselves in public. Naomi acknowledged all of it without feeding any of it. She checked the board, took report, watched hands, watched eyes, noted what was said and what was not. In Trauma Bay 3, the room where everything had split open, the lights still made everyone look tired and sharp at once. The monitors still gave off their thin, steady beeps. Patients still arrived carrying secret histories inside failing bodies. Work, real work, did not care about revelation. It asked only whether the right person would notice in time. Near the middle of the shift, a new resident started to speak over a nurse and then stopped himself. Later, a transport was delayed by 3 minutes because someone listened when a concern was raised the first time. Near dawn, Priya handed Naomi a chart and asked what she was seeing. Naomi answered in the same calm tone she had always used, the tone people now heard differently because they finally understood it had been earned somewhere harder than they had guessed. Nothing about her movements was grand. She hung fluids, checked pupils, adjusted blankets, documented cleanly, and kept people alive in the unglamorous margins where hospitals either became decent or failed to. In the ICU, Commander Owen Cade slept through most of that night, stable and recovering. Before the end of shift, however, a note arrived at the station. It was brief, written in a hand too strong to be mistaken for anyone else. It thanked her for the old save and the new one, and it added that some people still came home because she was in the room. Naomi folded the note once and slipped it into her pocket without showing anyone. Then she turned back to the monitors, to the patient in bed 4 whose pressure was beginning to trend the wrong way, to the family member trying not to panic in the corner chair, to the ordinary emergencies that did not come with escorts or rank or hidden recognition. That was where she belonged now, not in legend, not in reveal, but in the exact second before disaster, when silence and competence entered a room together, and only one of them needed to speak.